good evening and a warm welcome to all of you, and wish you all a very happy new year. This is the first lecture for this year. I'm very happy to invite Mr. Arun Mahizhnan and Ms. Nalina Gopal, who will be delivering this lecture. The Indian Heritage Center and the Institute of Policy Studies in Singapore recently published an authoritative and scholarly account of the 2000-year history of Tamil influence on and imprint in Southeast Asia and a more contemporary history of Tamil arrival and settlement in the island of Singapore. That's the book that you see here. Sojourners to Settlers, the two-volume book edited by them, features insightful essays by scholars around the world. I'd like to congratulate them on bringing out this book, this wonderful, beautiful production. The connections between Tamil Nadu and the lands across the Bay of Bengal speak of one of the most penetrating soft power projections anywhere in this world, and yet that tale has largely been forgotten or ignored or untold. Today's introductory talk about this book, telling the tale of Tamils across the oceans, is a gentle reminder of our continuities and discontinuities. A few words about the speakers. Mr. Arun Mahizhnan is a special research advisor at the Institute of Policy Studies. He was previously Deputy Director and the head of the Arts, Culture and Media Research Cluster in Institute of Public Studies. He was concurrently an adjunct professor at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at the Nanyang Technological University till 2017. He has also held senior positions in public communications, in broadcasting and public relations, broadcasting and public relations. He has been a long-time contributor to the development of arts and culture in Singapore and currently serves as chairman of the Intercultural Theatre Institute, a tertiary-level theatre training institute, and as a director of the Center for Singapore Tamil Culture, an NGO focused on building bridges across Singapore cultures. Currently, he is leading the effort to publish Singapore Chronicles, a 50-volume book series to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence. And Ms. Nalina Gopal is a curator at the Indian Heritage Center. She has a post-graduation in international studies from the University of Madras. Prior to joining the center in 2008, she was curator and registrar at a private museum in Chennai. Her research interests include South Asian diaspora in Southeast Asia, as well as Indian history and art. Her recent publications include Singapore Indian Heritage and Once Upon a Time in Little India. She has other publications to her credit too. In addition to the center's Heritage Center's permanent galleries, she has also curated exhibitions, including this book, Once Upon a Time in Little India, Symbols and Scripts, The Language of Craft, Chetty Melaka of the Straits, Rediscovering Peranakam, Indian Communities, and From the Coromandel Coast to the Straits, Revisiting Our Tamil Heritage. I invite both of them, and at the end of this lecture, there will be some time for a few questions. I hope we will have questions related to the topic of the day. Thank you very much for coming. Please.
Dr. Sundar, distinguished guests, and some of my very long-standing friends, good evening to all of you, and I thank you both on behalf of Nalina and myself for spending your evening with us. It's a real honor, pleasure and privilege for us. When I approached Dr. Sundar about this talk, I thought I will be saying a few words to a few people. But when he finally sent the publicity blurb, I was quite shocked. It was both an unexpected and undeserved honor for me to be delivering this talk under the auspices of Dr. Professor Muni Anandakrishnan Endowment Lecture Series. Prof, as he's affectionately known to all of us, has been my shepherd and my savior since the days of the establishment of the International Forum for Information Technology in Tamil. In short, we call it INFIT, since 2000. I've always been very mindful of meeting his high expectations, and that makes me even more nervous than I usually am. Fortunately, to make the honor less undeserving and to make this talk more erudite, I have enlisted the support of my co-editor, Nalina Gopal. Though younger than me by decades, she is wiser by a wide margin. In fact, it was she who conceived the book in the first place and approached me to edit it, simply because she needed some gray hair to add some gravitas, and she was not willing to dye her own hair. So I will ask her to speak to the genesis of this project, as well as the pre-modern Tamil presence in Southeast Asia, which is the subject of the first volume, and also a subject that she is far more expert in. I will deal with some very general aspects, and then with Tamils in Singapore, which is a subject of the second volume. Now, obviously, we are not going to summarize the whole 2 volumes, so you will have a legitimate excuse not to buy it, not to read it. So I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of the book to whet your appetite so that you would reach out for it when you have time. As most of you know, history is often written by victors about the losers. You also know that history is never written in one draft. It is written, rewritten, and rewritten again many times over in search of that ever-elusive objective truth. As I had to introduce the book at the recent book launch in Singapore, I'm going to self-plagiarize my own words at the event, which I hope is worthy of repeating here. In the post-fact, indeed post-truth world that has come upon us today, Professor E.C. Carr's fundamental question, what is history, is particularly relevant and compelling. Though many have decried Carr's idea of history as flawed, there is no denying that some of his observations and insights have guided historians over decades. His assertion that history is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, and unending dialogue between the present and the past, is, I think, a succinct statement of the process. While Carr at first sought objective history and subsequently rejected it, there was a general consensus about his conclusion that historians are all shaped by the society and the time they live in. Perhaps it is this notion that led T.S. Eliot to say, if one can really penetrate the life of another age, one is penetrating the life of one's own. I mentioned these historiographic references to lead to a related point about the sense of history among Indians in general and among Tamils in particular. The sense of history among ancient Tamils is decidedly different from that of the Greeks or the Chinese. They clearly lack written and specific records meeting with conventional standards of historiography, especially those dedicated or dictated by European scholars. On the other hand, Tamil classical literature dating from 300 BC to 300 CE is so rich with fascinating details and insights that amount to what Eliot would call a penetration of the life of another age. In addition, there are countless stone inscriptions, copper plates, palm leaves that record at least some aspects of life in ancient times. Some of these literary and lithographic references relate to Tamils in Southeast Asia. They provide a reasonably reliable evidence of the past. These have been addressed in our book, and that, we hope, will make this book worthy of serious notice. This book is appearing at a historical moment for Singapore. For your benefit, for those of you who are not familiar with Singapore history, we marked 2019 as the bicentennial year. It is the 200th anniversary of the start of the colonial rule with the establishment of a British trading post in 1819. At the same time, the country is also looking further back to 700 years ago, to 1219, when this island of Singapore was referred to as Temasek and Singapura. It was a prosperous port city ruled by the legendary king Sang Nila Utama. Most interestingly, one essay in our book by Dr. Ian Sinclair suggests that Singapore's history could actually be pushed back even further to 1,000 years because of possible Tamil connections. Nalina will mention more on that subject shortly. And coincidentally, for the Tamil diaspora around the world, 2019 also marked the public presentation of Tamil Nadu's Keezhadi excavations, which have been significant to a point of rewriting some of the long-held beliefs of archaeologists, historians, and social scientists. The swirling public debates about the Keezhadi findings form an instructive and reflective backdrop against which we can read the many historical accounts of Tamils in our book. I will now ask Nalina to talk about the origin of the book project and also about the pre-modern traces of Tamil footprints in Southeast Asia, and then I will come back to the podium. All right? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arun. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Sundar and the Rojamutia Research Library for this invitation. And I assure you I'm an ardent fan of the wonderful work you do in preserving and making accessible this rare archive. Indeed, several treasures of Singapore's early Tamil literature can be found preserved only here to the best of our knowledge. Secondly, I'm deeply indebted to Mr. Arun Mahizhnan for his encouraging and constant insistence in my participation in events such as this. It is humbling, and he leads by example for many of us as to how generous one must be with knowledge to foster partnerships that can now open avenues for innovative ventures, such as this one here. In this front, before I go further, I must begin by offering two humble alternative histories to events relating to the genesis of this book that Mr. Arun has just narrated. For those discerning in the audience, and for those familiar with the grind culture professionals are put through, we are, as you know, fed more by passion than dough. It is virtually impossible to remain immune to sprouting grey hair. So I too have some. It was not the grey that gave me confidence in his sole ability to steer this publication, but his absolute dedication, expertise, and passion for Tamil heritage. Next, he has credited me with conceiving this book, but in truth, in 2016, Mr. Arun had first announced a book project to document 200 years of Tamils in Singapore. He had, on his own account, reached out to scholars and community historians to document this momentous occasion. In 2017, knowing that we at the Indian Heritage Centre would be launching an exhibition on Tamils in Singapore in 2019, a year marking 200 years since the establishment of Singapore as a British trading outpost, we started courting Mr. Arun, seeking a collaboration between the two efforts. Our only insistence was to bring out the publication in 2 volumes, one on Tamils in Southeast Asia, to record the pre-modern presence as a preamble to modern migration. He generously agreed, and Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore was born. You can see it on the screen here and before you, as a book co-published by the Indian Heritage Centre and the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore, featuring 27 chapters written by 29 authors from Singapore, India, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the USA. As I'm speaking here as a representative of the Indian Heritage Centre, it is an absolute must that I take a moment to tell you about the work we do at the Centre, which has led to this book project. The Indian Heritage Centre is an initiative of the Government of Singapore. It is a heritage institution managed by the National Heritage Board of Singapore and was launched in 2015 to mark Singapore's 50th year of independence. The Centre preserves, documents, and showcases the story of Indians in Singapore within the larger context of Southeast Asia. The IHC, as we call it, was conceived as a focal point for the interpretation and preservation of the diverse Indian heritage that is in Singapore. It was envisioned as a place of belonging for the community and for the expression of their cultural heritage. It is a centre with programming and museum facilities of permanent and changing exhibitions which focus entirely on the diasporic narrative. This sets the centre apart from museums around the world who tend to focus on source cultures and their antiquities as the norm. While our permanent exhibition presents a chronological overview of Indians in Singapore, our special exhibitions are launched annually as either a result of international collaborations or local community partnerships. For instance, in 2018, we launched an exhibition on Singapore's little-known Peranakan Indian or Chutti Malacca community. And in 2019, in support of Singapore's bicentennial year, the IHC launched an exhibition entitled From the Coromandel Coast to the Straits, Revisiting Our Tamil Heritage. The exhibition, for the first time, combined both our approaches to exhibition making and for the first time brought together collections scattered around the world and treasured possessions from the community. This exhibition sought to present an uninterrupted history of Tamil heritage in Singapore. It is as a complement to this exhibition that we intended for Sojourners to Settlers to be launched as a permanent record of the longue durée narrative of Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore documented in the exhibition, bringing together artifacts in the collections of museums in India, Indonesia, New Zealand, and Netherlands, such as this bell fragment bearing a Tamil inscription in the collection of the Te Papa Tongarewa, and Singapore. The exhibition presents the scattered history and heritage of Tamils in the Straits region. In keeping with this narrative, we hoped for Sojourners and Settlers to provide lay readers an understanding of the long heritage for Tamils in the region and its connections with Singapore's Tamil history. In Sojourners to Settlers, the first volume traces Tamil connections, settlements, and influences in the Southeast Asian region, especially in the pre-modern era. The second volume focuses on Singapore, and I will leave it to Mr. Arun to speak about that volume. Now, maritime links between South India and Southeast Asia go back to the late prehistoric period. Tamils acted as intermediaries in a trade network spanning from the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean in the west to the other side of the Bay of Bengal. By the early centuries of the Common Era, pre-modern Tamil diasporas, including seafarers and traders traveling to littoral areas in Southeast Asian polities, had become common. Epigraphic and archaeological finds that attest to the early presence of Tamils in Southeast Asia include 10 medieval Tamil inscriptions, coins, Indo-Roman rowletted pottery, amongst others. The oldest inscription is one that is featured in this publication, together with several other epigraphic evidence that has been accumulated as the result of years of research of many of these authors. The Sangam anthologies contain the earliest literary references to Tamil contact with Southeast Asia. The Pattinapalai, dating to the 2nd century CE, describes the import of foreign merchandise from Kedah or Karagam to the Chola port of Pumpuhar, while Chithalai Satanar's Manimeghalai, written in the 5th to 6th century CE, alludes to Java. One of the most important aspects of this volume is the story of Tamil connections with Singapore, dating long before 1819, apparent in Dr. Ian Sinclair's groundbreaking essay. In this essay, he suggests that the naval campaign of Rajendra Chola had defeated the Srivijayan Kedah in 1025 CE, and it had an effect across the Malay world, seeing a rise in Tamil trade and settlement in the region. He raises the important question, as the Chola fleet must have sailed through the Singapore Strait on its way to the eastern coast of the Malay Peninsula. Did the Cholas leave traces in Singapore? He offers an interpretation of the Singapore stone inscription, thus far unattempted, suggesting its Chola connections. He surveys the possible traces of the Cholas in pre-modern Singapore in conjunction with evidence proffered in the Syajara Melayu or the Malay Annals. His dual capacities in Kawi, which is a Southeast Asian script, and Indian languages, his knowledge of cross-cultural histories between southern India and the Malay archipelago have enabled his undertaking of this effort. I'd like to spend a moment to elaborate on this particular aspect of both the exhibition and Sojourners to Settlers. Now, archaeological finds since the 1980s in Singapore's riverfront area strongly suggest that maritime networks connected India to the Kingdom of Singapura, a prosperous regional port for much of the 14th century CE. Situated at the access points of both the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, this port was of strategic significance and was central in the lucrative India-China trade. Sangnila Uttama of the Srivijayan dynasty founded the Kingdom of Singapura, it is believed, in the late 13th century CE. He and his descendants ruled Singapore for 5 generations until Iskandar Shah, one of his descendants, fled, driven out by Majapahit forces. He later founded the Kingdom of Malacca. As attested in the Syajara Melayu or the Malay Annals, these kings of Singapura claimed descent from Raja Chulan, who has been popularly identified with Rajendra Chola of the Chola dynasty. The victories of Chola kings in the Malay archipelago are listed in an inscription of the Tanjavur Big Temple dating to 1030 to 1031 CE. 13 place names are provided, of which 4 remain quite unidentified till date. Some scholars have recognized one of these names, Vare Pandur, as Singapore because Panchur was the place name for Fort Canning Hill at the heart of Old Singapura. The name Singapura itself has Indic roots, and it was likely adopted due to connections with South Indian polities. For instance, Singapuram was a common place name issued in the Chola territory, while Singainagar was the capital of the Arya Chakravartis of Jaffna. Singapura was also the name of a place in Trakiu in Vietnam as early as the 4th century CE. Tamil connections with Singapore can be traced now to the 11th to the 13th century CE based on evidence presented in the form of the Singapore stone as interpreted by Dr. Ian Sinclair. This is an image of the Singapore stone. I'll tell you what it is in a moment. Located at the mouth of the Singapore River, the inscription on the stone had attracted in the 19th century itself curious visitors before the British dynamited it in the year 1843. When dynamited, the inscription split into several pieces. 3 of the largest pieces, images of which you see here, were recovered by Lieutenant Colonel James Lowe of the East India Company and sent to the Asiatic Society of Bengal. The sandstone inscription was, before it was blown up, about 3 meters high and 3 meters wide, upon which a raised rim enclosed 50 lines of an inscription in an area spanning about 1.5 to 2.1 meters. Kern, a Dutch scholar, in 1908 identified that the inscription was written in the Southeast Asian script, Kawi, which was derived from Southern Indian Brahmi. While he identified some Sanskrit-sounding phrases, no interpretations on the inscription's content was offered. In the Indian Heritage Center's publication, Sojourners to Settlers, Tamils in Southeast Asia and Singapore, Dr. Ian Sinclair has offered an alternative reading of the stone's inscription. He has identified the phrase Kesariva in this particular fragment in the inscription and has suggested that this may be part of the classical title Parakesari Varman, adopted by several Chola kings, including Rajendra Chola I, more notably. This is extremely significant as it is the first interpretation of the inscription and suggests early Tamil presence in the Strait of Singapore. One of the mysteries surrounding the stone is the whereabouts of the 2 missing parts. These 2 parts are the missing ones. While the third one, which is this one, is in the collection and on display at the National Museum of Singapore, the missing parts have long been rumored to be in the collection of the Indian Museum in Kolkata. However, we can put this rumor to an end following a search conducted in collaboration with the Indian Museum in Kolkata in March 2018. The stone was never accessioned into the collection of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was the collection that the Indian Museum inherited. As is widely known, in 1848, the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal published a rubbing of the stone taken by J.W. Laidley of the Asiatic Society. A large format print of the rubbing was scanned by the Asiatic Society Library in high resolution on our request. The two missing parts were recreated based on this scan and are presented here in our exhibition as 3D holograms and here as images that you can see for the first time. A 3D scan of the extant part of the stone was also reproduced in the exhibition. So just a quick aside, these 2 were actually just rubbings, so they were in black and white, and these weren't even real rubbings, they were tracings that J.W. Laidley had done based on the inscription. And he had literally copied the inscription onto paper. So if you Google the words Singapore stone, you'll find a black and white image appearing. Now, based on the information available of this particular extant fragment, which is in the collection of the National Museum of Singapore, a team of technology and interactive developers developed these 2 images for us and placed the inscription here so that visitors to the exhibition could see the 3 parts together. Unfortunately, because it was dynamited and much of it turned to rubble, we are unable to put it back into the position that it would have been in the past as one single stela. Having made explicit the pre-modern Tamil connections with Singapore, I would now like to take you on a quick tour of the chapters in Volume 1, which have been contributed by noted archaeologists, epigraphists, art historians, as well as historians. We begin Volume 1 with an interesting chapter offering an essential account of the Tamil script and its evolution. As a result of finds at the sites of Purundal and Kodumanal and their radiometric dating, the author reveals the astounding antiquity of the script going back at least to the 6th century BCE in its ancient form and to medieval times in its present form. In this chapter, he traces the evolution of the Tamil script from different writing forms, but focuses on 3 articulations of the script, the Tamil Brahmi Grantha and Vattaletta forms, all of which shaped the formation of Tamil writing as we know today. On the other side of the Bay of Bengal, he points to evidence that Southeast Asians were aware and using Indian scripts as early as 2nd century BCE, such as those derived from the Southern Indian Brahmi script. Even more interestingly, he observes that the Indian scripts were instrumental in the origin and evolution of many Southeast Asian scripts, including those found in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Burma, or Myanmar. From there, we move to Singaporean art historian Suresh Kumar Muthukumaran's extraordinary treatise extolling the longue durée narrative of Tamils in Southeast Asia as a pre-modern diaspora whose commercial agendas apart, they were also motivated by diplomatic and matrimonial ties with Southeast Asian polities. He considers the long-standing interaction between Tamil-speaking peoples and Southeast Asian polities all the way down to the 16th century, a period marking the entry of the first European traders and colonists in Southeast Asia. From the cults of Ayyanar and Agastya to the appearance of the Tamil king Porkai Pandyan in a charm epigraph dating to the 5th century CE, he draws attention to Tamil mediation in the complex process of cultural convergence in Southeast Asia. He also makes the critical observation that there are reasonable grounds to suggest that Tamil speakers played an important role in the transmission of Sanskritic cultures within Southeast Asia. From archaeobotanical and art historical perspectives, we move to a survey of Indonesian literary and cultural traditions. Andrea Acri, who's based in Paris, offers an overview of the South Indian and especially Tamil contributions to the transfer of Hindu religious paradigms across the Bay of Bengal from the pre-modern period to recent times. That Murugan is the patron deity of the Tamil diaspora is a known fact. However, Acri's revelation of the worship of Kumara appearing in a textual passage in the old Javanese Ramayana Kakavin, which dates approximately to the mid-9th to the early 10th century CE, has been little known and is indeed revelatory. A remarkable moment in the cross-cultural history of South India and Southeast Asia occurred in the context of Buddhist exchanges. In 1006 CE, the Chola king Rajaraja I issued a grant stating that the construction of a Buddhist vihara or temple complex was begun under the auspices of the king of Kedaram or Kedah, Chudamani Varman, at Nagapattinam, and that the Chola ruler allocated revenue from a village named Anemangalam to support it. John Miksic, Singapore's pioneering archaeologist, surveys this and other significant relics of Tamil Buddhist interactions with the region. He reminds us that the influence of the Tamil country in Buddhist thought and art in Southeast Asia remains relatively underappreciated. Written evidence of Tamil mercantile activity is scattered across Southeast Asia. The author, Dr. Selvakumar, draws from his primary research and presents a comprehensive overview of Tamil epigraphs in the region. This chapter is seminal as it provides the visuals, the author is Y. Subbarayalu. This chapter is seminal as it provides the visuals, transliteration and translations for the significant corpus of Tamil inscriptions. The Tamil inscriptions found in Southeast Asia, though not many, form an important source for the footprint of Tamil merchants with Eastern countries, including China. The author surveys 9 inscriptions, 3 in Thailand, 1 in Burma, 4 in the island of Sumatra, Indonesia, including 1 which seems to be lost, and 1 in China, which excludes the more recent find of a bilingual 13th century CE inscription at Quanzhou, an ancient port city in the Fujian province of China. Based on this evidence, he highlights the presence of Tamil merchant guilds who use the Tamil language as their lingua franca for transactions and records, accompanied by priestly groups who adopted Sanskrit perhaps for ritual and other religious purposes. The sojourn of Tamil traders to Southeast Asia is not a recent phenomenon. In fact, B. Selvakumar dates it to about the 4th century BCE because of the development of an Indian Ocean trading network. Memory of this mercantile trajectory, he recounts, is couched in the linguistic, archaeological, art historical, and architectural fabric of Southeast Asia. Wanasara Nunsuk, who's a Thai archaeologist based in the US, provides an engaging survey of Thai associations with the Tamil country. Nunsuk is the archaeologist who discovered the oldest written evidence of Tamil presence in Southeast Asia. This potsherd that you see on the screen here. Dating to the 2nd century CE, this fragmented inscription appears on a black pottery shard from the ancient port of Phu Khao Thong on the western coast of the Isthmus of Kra. Noonsup dates the social interactions between the Tamil region and peninsular Thailand between the late centuries BCE and the early centuries CE, strongly connected by the monsoon winds, seafaring, and maritime trade patterns. The Indonesian archipelago is a vital key to the understanding of ancient Tamil presence in the Southeast Asian region. 2 chapters provide illuminating accounts of the pivotal role played by pre-modern Tamil diasporas in this region. First, E. Edwards Mackinnon offers insights into the medieval undertakings of Tamil merchants in Aceh and North Sumatra. Drawing from decades of primary research, he surveys rare art historical and numismatic evidence for Tamil presence at the Kota China site in the form of Chola provincial style Buddhist and Vaishnavite imagery, as well as Saivite imagery, which is closer to the Sri Lankan Polonnaruwa style. In a second chapter on the archipelago, Daniel Perret surveys Tamil maritime migration to the archipelago in the period beginning with the Chola raid of 1025 CE and ending in the 17th century. Perret submits that North Sumatra, due to its geographical position and its natural and agricultural resources, was at the forefront of the relations with the Tamil country, and that it certainly is the region of Southeast Asia that has delivered the greatest variety of evidence of this ancient Tamil presence. Moving on, Stephen Jayashila, who is based in Pondicherry, carries the story of Tamil mercantile activity into the early modern period. He examines the role of Tamil-speaking Coromandel Tamil Muslim merchant communities who pervaded the ports of Southeast Asia, from Paraverkadu or Pulikat, Mylapore, Kunimedu, Kadalur, Parangipete, Nagore, and Nagapattinam to the Straits of Malacca. Stephen issues a fascinating narrative of traders who came to function as Shahbandars, Bandaharas, and Saudagar Rajas or intermediaries in Southeast Asian states such as Malacca, Pasai, Bantan, among others. He also provides an account of the commodities that Tamil merchants traded in, such as rice and textiles, from the Coromandel while importing gold, copper, and tin from Southeast Asia. Intangible proof of the connected and uninterrupted histories between Tamil country and Southeast Asian societies has been preserved in linguistic practices. Tom Hugervorst provides a historical as well as a contemporary overview to demonstrate the vibrancy and durability of language contact between these regions. The finale to Volume 1 comes from Harvard, from Professor Sonil Amrit, who remarks on the Bay of Bengal's role for centuries as the maritime thoroughfare connecting China and India, with the Straits of Malacca as a hinge connecting the bay with the South China Sea. He likens the history of Tamil presence in Southeast Asia to a palimpsest, enriched by every wave of sojourning and migration. He suggests that modern settlements by migrants from the Coromandel coast took place against the backdrop of earlier settlements that had come before. He surmised that successive waves of movement across the Bay of Bengal have fashioned a complex history which has influenced modern Southeast Asia is an apt note for us to conclude Volume 1, and for me to conclude, to allow Mr. Arun to take you now through a quick whistle-stop tour of Volume 2 of the publication.
Okay, I hope there's no information overload. Nalina has provided a rather succinct summary of the whole of the first volume. The second volume, concentrating on our own country, is an unprecedented book in its scope, its depth, and its coverage. It provides a collection of essays detailing the collective and individual experiences of Tamil communities in Singapore in modern times leading up to contemporary times. Allow me to highlight just a few aspects of this. Though Tamils have been traversing the Bay of Bengal and its hinterland for some 2,000 years, most of them were sojourners. They came, they saw, they acquired, but most of them went back home. In the case of Singapore, the unbroken history of settled Tamils begins with the acquisition, as I mentioned earlier, of Singapore as a British trading post 200 years ago. The Tamil community in Singapore is clearly definable but not easily. It's clearly identifiable but not clearly definable. The interior landscape of this community, what erudite scholars would call Thinai in Tamil, is complex and complicated by its ancient civilizational origins and its contemporary diversities. Almost every attempt to define it is fraught with challenges ranging from semantics to politics, but nevertheless, we have ventured to present a series of stories, slices of social history, that will offer an insight into the interior of the Tamil community in Singapore. Tamils journeyed to Singapore and Malaya in large numbers, mostly as rubber estate workers and as craftsmen and as servants of the British colonial government. Some of them were sepoys who actually protected British interests in the colony. There is a colorful account of Tamil sepoys in this second volume. They are called the Forgotten Sentinels. It is a contrasting narrative to the usual coolie stories that fill the pages of our history. Another interesting historical chapter is the role of Tamils in Singapore-based Indian National Army. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. This was before the fall of the Japanese in 1945. They were very, very significant part of our history. This particular chapter is the story of a community torn between their deep affection for motherland, that's India, and a deep distrust for the Japanese with whom Subhash Chandra Bose consorted for the benefit of his own vision of Indian independence. Many, including my father-in-law, my wife Priya's father, was living in daily terror under the Japanese, but had supported the INA. There was one bright spot in this dark stage. The INA offered indentured and ill-treated estate workers and caste-bitten laborers a new status, a new identity that had long been denied to them. It even inspired Indian women to throw off the shackles of domesticity to stand along with the men and fight for Indian independence. In two other chapters in this book, you will see caste and women's status diagnosed in the Singapore context. As they say in Tamil, Kasikku ponalum karumam thalayada. The clutches of caste system took a very long time to lose its grips on Tamils, and Periyar's reform movement played a huge role in that transformation. Tamil leaders like G. Sarangapani used Tamil media and social organizations to mobilize the people to follow Periyar's preachings and eventually tame the caste system to manageable proportions. Caste was not wiped out from Singapore, but relegated to a subterranean status. However, I should add that with the recent wave of Indian immigrants to Singapore, it is stirring up this beast from its slumber by introducing their caste and communal practices in our social organizations. Another chapter deals with the evolving status of Tamil women, most of whom in the early years migrated to Singapore as wives or as dependent children. With settlement, modernization, and social progress, Tamil women have now carved out a new status as well as new roles in society. It is altogether a happy story. For those interested in Tamil media in Singapore, there is much grist mullen. I hope you have seen it already. You may be interested to know that the first Tamil newspaper started in 1870s in Singapore, along with Malay newspapers. Unfortunately, numerous papers have perished, and there is only one that has survived time, and that is the Tamil Murasu, founded in 1935 by Mr. G. Sarangapani. By the way, he too was a young immigrant from Tamil Nadu to Singapore. He was not born and bred there. The other prominent newspaper of long duration was Tamil Nation, which was inaugurated in 1924 but came to a sad end earlier last year in 2019. Though led by very different personalities and different ideologies, these two newspapers collectively did more than most other newspapers put together for the betterment of the Tamil communities in Malaya, then Malaysia and Singapore. And Nalina herself has a wonderful chapter in this volume that not only traces a thread that stretches from the Coromandel coast to Singapore, spanning from 15th century to 21st century, but also lays out the family trees, 3 families whose generations go back between 7 and 8 generations. And you can see every single name of the family member in the book. This is the first time such a Tamil family map has been published in Singapore. Till the 1950s, many Tamils in Singapore were in the sojourner mode, though some of them have been there for generations. Like my wife is a 4th generation Singaporean. U, meaning the birthplace in India, was still home to them. However, with the independence movement taking hold of the local populations in Malaya and Singapore, the idea of settling forever was taking root. By 1965, when Singapore became fully independent, the settlers were urged to become citizens of a nation state. Many Tamils took up citizenship, and over time, they began to develop an identity that incorporated Singapore in it. That is, Indian Singaporean or Tamil Singaporean. Though I have compressed the long journey from sojourners to settlers to citizens in a few sentences, it was not without lots of twists and turns. This book describes, explains, and examines some of those detours. The allure of India as a homeland was diminishing, while the attraction of Singapore as a modern metropolis made it easier for Indians to relinquish their interest in India and loosen their ties with India. It is also noteworthy that independent India post-1947 paid increasingly less attention to Singapore or Southeast Asia for that matter. It was, in a sense, mutual disengagement. One of the big challenges we Tamils in Singapore face today is how long can we maintain this hyphenated identity as Tamil Singaporeans. With English becoming our mother tongue, not just first language, and with Western lifestyle as the norm, and cosmopolitan values as the base, what of the Tamil identity can we or should we keep? That is the big question that, becoming and being Tamil in today's and tomorrow's Singapore is not preordained, nor will it take a predictable course. Singapore professes to be multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and multilingual. That is an ideal we hope to maintain. However, the trend is towards monolingual, meaning English, and monocultural, meaning semi-Western, and possibly monoethnic, with the ever-increasing mixed marriages. The challenges of being Tamil are complex and continuous. One of the strongest foundations of Tamil identity is the Tamil education our children receive within our school system because of the compulsory second language policy of the government. It's for all Singaporeans. The Chinese will have to study Mandarin, the Malays, Malay language, and the Indians officially will study Tamil, but they can also offer Punjabi, Malayalam, and all the other languages as well, outside the school system. One chapter in this book gives you an insight into this system, but it also touches on the struggles ahead. The last chapter in this volume is deliberately placed there because it addresses a vital and central question faced not just by Tamils or even Indians, but by all Singaporeans as we look to the future. We call it the ness question, as in Tamilness, Indianness, Chineseness, Singaporeanness. This is a question that concerns young Singaporeans, especially because their identity is fluid and flowing and morphing in different directions, in different ways. It is not the first time, of course, that Singaporeans have to face the identity question. Many Singaporeans living today have evolved from being British subjects to Malaysian citizens to Singaporeans. There are many people in Singapore. Despite the Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others framework, we call it the CMIO framework. That's how we define all Singaporeans. We now have not only Sino-Indians or Indo-Malays, and lately Sino-Indo-Euro-Malays, and many other permutations because of the proliferating mixed marriages I mentioned. Our last author, Arun in this book, is indeed a multi-hyphenated Singaporean. He has Malay blood, he has Chinese blood, he has Tamil blood, and he has even some, it is what we call in Malay language a rojak, it's a real mixture. So it is fitting that he shares some insight into how we define ourselves ethnically and yet fully integrated with the other. We have no choice. Mismanaged othering of our compatriots has in the past and will in the future lead to disastrous consequences. While no one wants to be the same, we could all be one people. He summons the pronouncement of Singapore's first foreign minister, who happens to be a Sri Lankan Tamil Singaporean by the name of S. Rajaratnam, to clinch his argument. And Mr. Rajaratnam said way back in the 1960s, being Singaporean is a matter not of ancestry, but of choice and conviction. Let me conclude by saying that our book is far, far from being definitive or comprehensive. Indeed, there is no such book up to now in Singapore. Our best hope is that it will be considered by our keen readers, not just scholars and academics, as a first firm step towards the writing of the complex history of Tamils in Singapore and Southeast Asia. I also wish to take this occasion to highlight a critical problem in Singapore, which is a paucity of Singaporean scholarship studying Tamils. I can't even name 5 people in Singapore who are serious scholars of the Tamil community in Singapore. As we have discovered, there is also a dire shortage of Indian scholars studying Tamils in Singapore or Southeast Asia. With the growing economic and strategic interest between the two nations, and with the ASEAN region in the recent decades, I hope there will be greater attention to the historical and social connections between us that began more than 2,000 years ago. By the way, yesterday afternoon I met with Mr. Uday Chandran and to present a copy of the book to him. And he straight away told us that, he and his department and the government is actually very interested in expanding the explorations, not just on the archaeological exploration, but also to look at the Tamil presence in Southeast Asia as well as in Singapore. That was very encouraging to me. And I hope institutions like the Roja Muthaya Reference Library will have which already has a wealth of knowledge and scholarly connections, you could help form a platform for our continued collaborations, especially to you, sir. We really look forward to others to come forward to write the next chapter, the next book, the next series. And with that, I want to thank you for giving Nalina and me this wonderful opportunity, and thank you all for being here to listen to us. It's truly an honor for us. Thank you very much.